Hope things are going well. Few good questions for this week, so I thought I would address them in this week's Q&A video. So the first one, student asked, wanting to learn a bit more about the Cambodian intervention, which has this determinative effect on Southeast Asian affairs. So Cambodia is, remember, it was a French colony. French had taken over in the late 19th century. They rule it in concert with Vietnam and Laos in an entity called French Indochina. The primary rebellion in the 1940s and 1950s is the Communist Rebellion from Vietnam, but in the aftermath of the Geneva Accords, which create this independent North Vietnam and independent South Vietnam, they also create the independent Laos and Cambodia. And in Cambodia, the leader becomes a monarch, Prince Sihanouk. A interesting figure in many respects, a talented political operator. And Sihanouk is governing this weak country, very small military in a dangerous part of the world. He increasingly comes under the belief that accommodating the interests of the communists is essential to the survival of his regime, which may very well have been the correct belief. He develops a relationship with the People's Republic of China. He more or less looks the other way after the North Vietnamese use the northeastern part of Cambodia to funnel military supplies to the communists in South Vietnam. At the same time, he comes under heavy pressure from the Americans to stop these arms sales, and he says, "Look, we're a weak country. We're doing what we can." He is officially a neutralist in the Cold War. That is, that he aligns neither with the communist nor with the non-communist side, and he remains in power for 16 years. So there's part of a degree of political survival here. In 1970, he's in China on a travel mission, and U.S. crosses the border to invade, and the head of the Cambodian military, a man named Lon Nol, NOL, launches a coup that overthrows the Sihanouk government, creates a nominally democratic regime with Lon Nol as the leader, but this is quickly displaced and it becomes a military dictatorship. And between 1970 and 1975, Sihanouk is now in exile. Cambodia is headed by this right-wing authoritarian military government under Lon Nol, which is aligned with the United States in the war in Vietnam. And even after the U.S. militarily pulls out of South Vietnam, the U.S. continues to supply lots of aid to South Vietnam and continues to sustain aid to Lon Nol. But Lon Nol's government really has no domestic base of support. There's a civil conflict that emerges within Cambodia with communist forces fighting against the Lon Nol government. So in effect, the Vietnam War comes to Cambodia full stop after the U.S. intervention and the emergence of Lon Nol as the leader. And when the U.S. finally pulls out of South Vietnam, it pulls out all personnel from South Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese state collapses. Lon Nol flees the country, eventually goes into exile in the United States, where he dies in the 1980s. And in the aftermath, in the political vacuum, Sihanouk can't really come back, and instead, the communist faction, this radical faction called the Khmer Rouge, takes over, and the Khmer Rouge will govern Cambodia for 4 years, from 1975 till 1979. It's a genocidal regime, and eventually they are displaced by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese communists invade Cambodia to stop the genocide, and the Khmer Rouge people are forced to flee. Now, the question here is whether all of this was caused by the U.S. military intervention. Here, my sense is no. or whether the U.S. military intervention contributed to the resulting political instability. And here, I think obviously the answer is yes. But what happened to Cambodia is similar in this respect to what happened to Laos. These are weak neighboring states, and they're kind of dragged into the Vietnamese, the broad international conflict over Vietnam, in a way that Thailand, a much more stable state and a stronger military component, is able to avoid. Second question, a couple on the 76 campaign. A few people asked about Ford's gaffe. More information on Ford and foreign policy. What happened basically when he rambled about Poland not being under the control of the Soviet Union. And then the flip side of this: how did Carter lose a 40-point lead, which is hard to do and is a really good question. With regards to Carter first, this is a Carter campaign button from 1976. Carter sweeps the early primaries, even though he's not well known. He wins the Iowa caucuses, he wins the New Hampshire primaries on this kind of fresh face approach. He's a peanut farmer from Georgia. He served one term as governor. He says, in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, where Nixon is forced to resign, he says, I'm not going to lie to the American people. He's a deeply religious man, and there's this sense that, in the aftermath of Nixon's tenure, maybe moving towards a more religious approach would be positive. As governor of Georgia, he has a very good civil rights record, so he responds to this idea of the civil rights movement, redeeming the Democratic Party, and the stronger candidates in 76 either don't run or they run poor campaigns. Maybe I think the strongest candidate against him was an Idaho senator named Frank Church, but Church he's doing the investigation of the CIA and the Senate. He waits too long to get in, and Carter races to the lead, and basically around halfway through the primary process almost has the nomination wrapped up. And then people start looking at him, and what they see is, look, this guy's been one-term governor of Georgia. He's speaking in generalities. No one quite knew where he came from. He actually turns out to be, I think, more moderate than the Democratic Party was. And in the latter stages of the primaries, he loses almost all of them, but he has enough delegates where he gets the nomination. Meanwhile, and I'll be talking about this in a sec, there's deep divisions within the Republican Party. Gerald Ford, there's the sense that it was a kind of corrupt bargain, that he had gotten he'd been appointed Nixon to the vice presidency, succeeded Nixon to the presidency, and then had pardoned Nixon. And he does it, he says, and I believe he's correct, and looking back now in hindsight, to avoid, to bring a sense of closure to Watergate rather than have the former president go on trial. But it does a number on his public opinion ratings. Also, inflation is very high in 75 and into 76, and there's this sense that Ford is overmatched as president. So Carter at the peak, has this 40-point lead. The problem for Carter is that the more people look at Carter, liberals, moderates, and conservatives, frankly, the less appealing they find him, and there's almost this sense that there's no there. The specifics of his program are quite unclear. And the irony of Carter is, if the 76 election had gone on for a couple of weeks longer, or if the 76 Democratic primaries had gone on for a couple of weeks longer, it's entirely possible he wouldn't have gotten the nomination, or would have lost the general election. And then with regards to the Ford gaffe in Poland, I think there were two things that were working in concert here. The first is, and you got a sense of it from watching the video, Ford is not he's a deeply sincere man, but he's certainly not the most articulate figure in the world. He comes across poorly in public speaking events, and so that hurts him. The second thing is that Ford, to get the Republican nomination in 1976, if you look closely here, this is a cover of Time, it's a cartoon, this WIN button. So it's this Ford winning. No, it's that Ford, to meet the challenge of inflation, had White House staffers wear a button that said WIN, which stood for Whip Inflation Now. That was his anti-inflation initiative, which can suggest why he was in trouble in the polls. Ford was facing this primary challenge from Ronald Reagan, former California governor, who attacks him from the right, says that Ford has not done enough to stand up against the Soviet Union. And Reagan spends a lot of time attacking the Helsinki Accords. saying that Ford has basically caved into the Soviets, which is just absurd. I mean, Helsinki just acknowledged what was there. So in the primary, Ford had gotten used to this particular line of defense that Helsinki did not represent a cave-in to the Soviets, and he had used this line about Poland, being autonomous, and and the Vatican signing on to the treaty. So this had become kind of his standard response to the Helsinki question. And then when it got into the Carter debate, Carter is not attacking him from the right. So if you're Ford, this is not an area you even need to discuss. But you could sort of tell from his face, he kind of froze, and he had this response in the back of his head, so he sort of splurted it out, and it came. It's a classic gaffe. But as always is the case with political gaffes, the most damaging gaffes are gaffes that confirm preconceptions about the candidate. And the preconception about Ford was that he was essentially intellectually out of his league as president. So when he gets up on the debate stage and says Poland is under the control of the Soviet Union, people are inclined to see that as damaging. Whereas, let's say Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, no one would ever argue that these guys weren't brilliant, had said that in debate. People said, "Oh, it was just a mistake," and they clearly didn't believe it. But with Ford, that didn't happen. How frequently are covert operations utilized by presidents from Nixon onward? And since the media was likely kept in the dark about these operations, at what point did they find out? Well, this is a slight preview of what's coming in the snippets for next week. This is Reagan with William Casey, who's his director of Central Intelligence. It turns out that after declining a bit under Carter, CIA covert operations bump up substantially under Reagan. They're a key aspect of Reagan's policy in Central America and in Afghanistan in particular. And the problem here is that there are covert operations, and then there are covert operations. It's really, really hard, even if you designate an operation as covert, to maintain the secrecy behind this in a government where everyone leaks like a sieve. And so one of the stories that we see with, and I'll be talking more about this in the snippets for next week, is that Reagan at the end of the day isn't able to keep covert operations covert. I mean, the Afghan covert operations, where the U.S. is supplying aid to the anti-communist mujahideen in Afghanistan, Congress actually votes on the appropriation. So it's not really too secret when Congress is voting for it in public. And then the last question: how were Latin American U.S. relations altered after the Augusto Pinochet government was initiated? This is a good question. And to me, I think the biggest change was that the obviousness of Pinochet's hostility to basic principles of human rights and, frankly, decency energized the political left in the United States. They saw this regime and the U.S. involvement in the installation of this regime as a moral failing on the part of the United States, and they became much more energized. And so in the mid and late 70s, there's a surge in Congress to sort of prioritize human rights, especially in Latin America, and to say that the U.S. is no longer going to provide substantial amounts of assistance to these right-wing military regimes that are suppressing human rights in places like Chile and Argentina and Uruguay, which has a brutal military government in the mid-70s, and Brazil. And so as a result, I think the biggest alteration comes in opponents of the Pinochet regime becoming much more active in Congress. And two examples here. This is Michael Harrington, who was a very, very liberal Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, from the North Shore, north of Boston, and he is the key player in the House at reducing aid to the Chilean regime after Pinochet takes office. Arguably, he violates House rules by leaking some of this information, but he defends himself successfully in the process. And basically, Democrats as well as liberal Republicans do not want to be on record as supporting this Chilean government. And on the left here, we see a young Ed Koch, the future mayor of New York City, serves 12 years in the late 70s and 80s. As Mayor Koch is centrist, even center right. But when he served in the House, he represented a district on the Upper East Side. Koch was very, very liberal. And Koch is the point person for cutting off U.S. aid to Uruguay, a longtime democracy where the country kind of tears apart at the seams in the early 1970s, and the military takes over and launches this campaign to target leftists within Uruguay. And the Koch Amendment is successful in cutting off aid to the military regime in Uruguay. So I think that was the biggest effect, that the backlash to these right-wing military governments in the southern cone of South America energizes liberals within Congress. Now, as we kind of saw right at the end of the snippets, and certainly as we'll be seeing next week, there is a backlash to this liberal backlash, and in the 1980s, U.S. foreign policy will be much more conservative. So that's what we have for the snippets for this week, and hope everyone is doing well.